consequences are really huge. This shock was really exogenous and global at the same time, and it has impacted several countries, and especially the most industrialized one, and the spread, the consequences, the diffusion process appear really uneven regarding to that. So it is a type of social and spatial divide with a lot of change of habits, maybe probably now, but maybe in the future as well. And the spatial, the regional, and the territorial effects of the pandemic need to be really carefully addressed. And they are addressed, for example, in a very nice paper by Bailey and Al in regional studies, where all these problems, all these spatial and regional dimensions are addressed. I have to say that the proximities, the different types of proximity, really take a place at the heart of this drama and really take a place in the more intimate mechanisms of the COVID pandemic. COVID-19 challenges the different types of proximity, as we try, but also they become more dangerous and more distant at the heart of our social and economic life. So let's start with a few spatial evidences about the COVID pandemic. So it is obvious, and everybody nowadays, 3 days ago, of the number of COVID case notified rate, and it's pretty obvious that Europe and also Northern America are really at the heart of the COVID pandemic nowadays. This is really interesting, and also it appears that more or less COVID hit the most industrialized countries in the world, more or less. If we come back to Europe, we see that the number of deaf people in Europe is really different regarding the types of countries. And it's not uneven. It's not even in any sense. So there are a few countries, especially in the northern part of Europe, but also in Greece, which really suffered from a very small number of cases of COVID and a very small number of deaths. But also, on the other hand, there are other countries, and mostly the most populated countries of Europe, which really suffered a lot, and let to say the UK, more than 50,000 cases today. France, Spain, Italy, also Belgium is very impressive in this way. So there are huge spatial differences between different countries, even in the EU. Here there is an animated map which shows you the diffusion of the fatalities of the COVID-19 around Europe and across Europe during the first wave, during the lockdown. We can see here, first, of course, that there are huge differences between the shocks of the pandemics regarding the regions, regarding the countries, regarding the areas, but also that there are differences between large cities and other places, and also that the diffusion takes different paths, be there through neighborhoods or along the transport routes. I have to say that I took this map from an upcoming report from Bourdin and Al, including several Romanian researchers, which is really, really awful, which is really tremendous regarding that. But now the second wave is coming. So new deaths are appearing at the second days. Here I've made the selection from the sources of the Financial Times, and you can see that the European Union, but also France, also Romania, Spain, and so on, are climbing the second wave, and the second wave is coming and is climbing. But there are differences regarding the different type of countries. and it is quite different. So the second wave is almost everywhere, but the peculiarities of the diffusion are really different regarding the different types of countries. So I've been isolated, just to give you an example, 3 cases. You see that in France, there have been a huge first wave, and now we are becoming, or we are really climbing the second wave. In Romania, the first wave was very, very small or quite nothing, and now there's really a second wave. And in Sweden, that's exactly the reverse way. So with a huge first wave, and now it's not clear that the second wave will appear. So there are a lot of differences regarding the countries, and this is the example, this is the exemplification of the thing that there is really an uneven spatial, regional, and territorial impact. And now I will enter a bit more into the details in order to illustrate this really interesting diffusion at the level of the territories, the region, and the spaces. So the first very interesting result has been the sudden reintroduction of national borders in Europe. So we're used to live in the Schengen area with no borders, and then suddenly, not only the Schengen area has been isolated from the other parts of the world, which is more or less the case, but also there have been the return of the borders between the European countries. This has been only temporary, made for a temporary time. It has been very sudden. Then we have come back to kind of normality regarding that, but it asks a lot of questions. First question it asks is that it has been done during a crisis period, so it can be repeated for other crisis period in the future. And also it has given good arguments for nationalism in order to say it is possible. It is possible. We can come back to a border, to national border as well. Every time we want, we can do that. The second thing regarding the diffusion of the uneven impact of the pandemic is about the fact that even within countries, we can see very important diffusion. Here on the left-hand side, I've put the map of the of the number of deaf people in France during the first wave, and you can see that the big differences. So some regions like the Île-de-France or Alsace are really hit by the pandemic, but in other places like Brittany, for example, there have been no cases at all during this first wave, and now it's really different. The second wave is really different because it has spread, the COVID has spread everywhere. And the region which is the most hit by the COVID is the region Rhône-Alpes, which is around Lyon and Grenoble at this time. So on the right-hand side, you see the potential effects of the COVID-19. And you see also that this effect can really vary from one region to another, and it depends mostly from this region to their exposition to tourism, mostly. So you can see that here several in red, several countries in the southern part of Europe, like Italy, Spain, some part of Greece, and so on, could be Austria, could be really heated, and some other parts could suffer loss of the possible impact of the COVID. So there are huge differences. Another very interesting spatial challenge is about the metropolitan disease. So it is very clear that during the first wave, the major metropoles and the large cities are really suffered more from the pandemics than the rural or peri-urban area. And the reason of this is that the pandemic has been transmitted via international routes and especially via airplanes. And once borders have been shut, the global diffusion has been stopped. So that's really interesting to see this effect of globalization, which has hit first the big cities of the world. There are still a lot of spatial inequalities in front of this COVID virus. These regional, national, or territorial differentiated effects can be related to various causes. First, the geographical peculiarities. When there are groups of nations, like we are in Europe, which are used to have a lot of exchanges between them, it eases the diffusion of the pandemic, of course. When also there are strong connections between infected areas, like railways, highways, roads, and so on and so on. Also, we will see that countries have taken very differentiated strategies in front of that. So, for example, in Australia, New Zealand, they took very strong isolation measures and they closed the borders. So in Australia, it is said that they will not reopen nothing between 2022 and maybe more. In other places like China, they decided for strong and authoritarian lockdown, and they put people into the houses and they blocked them in order to stop the diffusion of the pandemic, and it has been probably a success as well. In other places like Singapore, for example, they claim and they oblige people to download the COVID app, and this has led to a control not only of the states, but of the people between them. They are been successful in stopping the epidemic with regard to this very authoritarian decision. And also it reveals this pandemic the strong or the weak organizational capacities of the states, which are really differentiated regarding to that. And also it reveals, of course, as I stated with the cities, the differences in terms of density, namely urban agglomeration versus less populated ones, where the conditions are really, really different, and I will show you afterwards. So the main impact, of course, is and has been and is still on transport and tourism activities. Transport societies, and especially airline companies or transport by airplanes have been really shocked by the pandemic. So now they are trying to survive, but probably a lot of unemployment, and still now, and a lot of bankruptcies in the airport companies. Regarding the airlines companies like Boeing or Airbus, at the moment they put the stress on their providers and also their subcontractors, but it can change in the future, and probably they will suffer a lot. That's the same for the cruise ships and related activities. Now, a lot of boats have been directed to Turkey, to Bangladesh, in order to be destroyed or reformulate, and so on and so on. And also, the impact of this crisis is really huge and is really important on the countries and the regions we choose to devote a large part of their activity to tourism. Here you see this small chart, which indicated that tourism and travel activity are the most impacted activity, contrary to pharmaceutical activity, for example, of course. The impact on of transport and tourism activity is really huge. It is said by the World Bank that it's more than $1 billion in 2020, and probably and maybe more in 2021. If we come back to Europe, we see here that the jobs are risk, of course, completely different regarding the types of countries. When you have countries like, for example, Greece or Austria, whose economies are really devoted towards tourism, the problem is and will be very important. And of course, it's probably more minor in several countries where like the northern countries, for example, where the level of tourism is smaller. So the difference is really important and the impact is huge. Also, there is the question of the cities. Here are charts of various few cities in the world, and they are all in common the fact that they are hit by the pandemic. And in all those cities, there is an excess of deaths during the first wave. There is no exception to that. So there are different types of curves, but no exception to the fact that they suffered a lot from the first wave of pandemic. And if I have taken pictures of rural areas, it will be very, 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 very different, of course. We have to say a few words. I will say a few words about this peculiar situation of the cities. So cities really are more affected by the spread of the pandemic than rural or peripheral areas. And even in some cities, there have been a kind of urban-rural migration during the first wave. This means that a lot of people, it was, for example, the case in Paris, hundreds of thousand people came out from Paris and went back and went to secondary houses or rural and peripheral houses or areas or small cities. And then this is very interesting in this term of this idea that the cities are dangerous during an era of pandemic. We'll come back to that as well. Also, especially in the cities, there have been the rise and the return to local food. So a lot of consumers turn to local food, and it has been very true and very, very obvious in the main cities. So the people were asking and looking for local food, big queues in front of bio or local food system. And then it asks the question of the agriculture near the cities, but also of the urban agriculture in the cities, because it has the question of future pandemics, of future crises, but maybe it is only reserved to the rich, or the richest people, because these goods they have the highest prices, and also it's not easy to access for them in the poor places. And one of the issues of the future now is how to feed the cities, because now more than 50% of the humanity lives in cities. It's about 70 to 80% in the European countries. We have to address this question of the future, how to feed these cities in case of a big crisis. Another thing related to the urban agglomeration is the kind of revenge of the peri-urban areas. So the peri-urban areas, the suburbs, have been really denounced for a lot of time because they are said to consume a lot of space and land. They come to the artificialization of the soils. That's their place with the reduced social life, difficulty to commute, etc., etc. But during this pandemic and even now, it is obvious that they regain a lot of interest in terms of safe places. And all the indicators show that a lot of people, they don't go to the rural areas, but they want to go to the most peri-urban areas because they are less crowded, and also they give the opportunity to have an access to nature, which is somewhat impossible in the most crowded places. I have to say that this crisis reveals a lot of social and spatial inequalities. And the people who are living in disadvantaged locations are the most affected. Be there because they live in crowded apartments with a lot of people in the same place, the risk of infection in small houses and small rooms. That's the question of the number of square meters of these apartments, of course, and also the sanitary conditions. Can you open the windows? Do you have a terrace, something, and so on and so on. That's also the possibility to be access to natural spaces like forests and parks. I've said that about peri-urban areas, and also the possibility of private gardens or to live in apartments. So the conditions, the spatial conditions are really different, and people are suffering or maybe enjoying kind of lock-in situation with regard to their position in terms of location. There are huge social, spatial segregation and exposure to risk infection regarding the type of work. There is major inequalities, to make it simple, between, on the one hand, teleworkers who can work at home and organize themselves at home and stay safe, and people who are forced to travel or to commute to join their office. And in this way, there is a big divide between white and blue collar. And we have to address this, because now it's possible, obviously, to work at a distance for certain types of jobs, as yours and mine probably, but it's really difficult for other labor to do that. And this is very crucial, and this will be very crucial in the future. And also, and maybe to finish with this, there is also the question of well-being and mental health. There are now many reports about the fact that during the first wave or during the lock-in periods, have been a lot of health and mental health and well-being issues. Health because people couldn't go to the hospitals and so on. Mental health because a lot of people who have been locked in didn't support that very well, and also a lot of well-being issues of people and differences between the fact that some people really suffer from the fact to be isolated at home, and it's really crucial for the oldest people, for example. Also, the problem of social distancing with the mask and difficulty to communicate and to exchange and so on. And also, and most of all, probably, the loss of contact with family and relatives. And a lot of people are claiming that they suffered a lot from the impossibility to meet and to really exchange in face-to-face relations with their family and their relatives. Last thing I have to say about this is we will not go into normal. We have to admit this, because I heard a lot of things about resilient societies. Resilience means you have a shock and you come back to the previous situation. We will not come back to this previous situation, because the heat, the shock has been so huge in terms of pandemics, but in terms of societal things, and also in terms of economic disease, that we will not come back to this normal situation. We will enter a new phase. And this new phase, of course, it is addressed by the recovery plan of the EU. It's about, if it is voted, it's about 750 million euros, nothing compared to the 2 billion euros which have been put on the table as far now by the US administration. It will increase in the future probably, but it's really huge. And it's really interesting to see the size of the efforts. So now let me turn to the proximities and to tell you that really the proximities are at stake everywhere in this pandemic. They are at stake, and mainly for two reasons. The first reason, and I will try to show you, is that they are at the very core of the process that we are living nowadays. Different types of proximity are really at the heart, especially in the more intimate mechanisms of the pandemic. On the other hand, their profound nature is affected by the pandemics. So it means that they are transformed by the pandemic, and sometimes they are reversed by this pandemic. Let's start with geographical proximity. Usually, geographical proximity is sought for, especially when it is associated with the need for contact and interaction, especially at the local level, what is called organized proximity. For example, the search for geographical proximity explains the constitutions and the maintaining of the main urban agglomeration. I published a paper with Lise Bourg-de-Lepage on this topic, a very recent book edited on urban empires by Ed Glaser, Peter Nijkamp, and Karima Kotit, and we showed that proximity are really at the heart of these agglomerations. Of course, and most obvious and pretty well known, it is the fact that this geographical proximity is at the basis of industrial or innovative clusters. And of course, everybody knows about the success of places like Silicon Valley or Bangalore, of places like that, when there are at the same time geographical proximity and organized proximity for the sake of development or innovation. But nowadays, during the pandemic, there is a reversal of the perception of geographical proximity. The causality is reversed. The risk of spreading COVID is so important, especially in the heart of the cities, or in the urban agglomeration, that we come to the so-called unwanted geographical proximity. People try to avoid too much contact. They try to avoid to see friends, family, or even relatives in order not to be affected by the COVID pandemic. And nowadays, geographical proximity is considered as something dangerous. And of course, related to that, we have the effects of the social distancing. The public authorities impose different measures of barriers, of geographical barriers, like masks, lockdown, physical distances, and so on, and borders and so on. And they try to isolate the most as possible people in order to avoid too many transmission of the virus. These methods which are called social distancing, the name is really well adapted because they are not only physical distancing, but also they are made of social rules in order to maintain the distance. And these methods, I have to say, of course, they are very old origins in the Middle Age of the Renaissance, but they have been theorized more than 100 years ago by the Dr. Mark Starkloff during the influenza pandemics, and they have been proved to be efficient in the absence of a vaccine. And their goal, the goal of this method of social distancing, is to reduce the negative effects of geographical proximity, because there's too much geographical proximity everywhere. And this excess of geographical proximity at the moment is raising social and spatial divide. The probability of infection increases, as I said, in urban areas and also in houses, in apartments. So there is a big difference. If you live in an apartment, you are exposed to huge geographical proximity, especially if you are poor, especially if you're living in a very, very small apartment, and so on and so on. And it's completely different if you live in an individual house in a remote area, when you can go outside in your garden and in the nature and enjoy the place and wait for the end of the story. So the density variables like square meters, number of rooms, big family, co-location, having a garden, a terrace, and so on, really, really play an important role nowadays during this pandemic. And of course, it has to be said that the offices become dangerous. So there have been a huge efforts in the recent years to innovate in terms of open spaces in the office, in terms of third places, with the exchange of different types of people around the work and also pleasure and so on, the development, the rise of co-working places and so on. But nowadays, those places appear to be dangerous, and they appear to be at the origin of the most important clusters with restaurants, the sport facilities, and so on, regarding a very recent study on that. So they spread the virus, and that's the reason why, as far as possible, public authorities try to impose or to negotiate in order to develop telework or work at a distance. And that's the reason why we have a rise of distant proximities now. We see the boom of Zoom. Okay, we are on Zoom now, today. Also, the boom of distant meetings of different types, and it appears to be possible in a way. That's also the rise of teleworking in several countries. It's really huge, and several companies like Microsoft, for example, decided to do everything on teleworking during 1 year, or maybe more. So also that's the diffusion and the development of the COVID information apps, which allow you to know if there are some people affected by the COVID in your neighborhood as well. And during the same time, there have been the huge slump of meetings, of trade fairs, and so on, and also the huge reduction of family and social rejection, and also the thing that a part of this relation moved to distant relation. But is it possible for every type of relation? Of course not, because it obviously depends on the types of works and the types of jobs you are doing and the types of relation you have with people. So you cannot avoid any type of geographical proximity, or you cannot replace, you cannot shift from geographical to organized proximity at a distance in every case. It is possible for several situations, but not for all. And the question is, is it definitive or is it temporary as well? But the rise of distant proximity is really important nowadays. If we come back now to the family and social relations, for example, Amazon has inflated its market capitalization by 500 billion euros since the beginning of the pandemic. So that's really huge. That's more than 250 billion for Microsoft and more than 200 billion euros for Apple. So what we call the GAFAM have really beneficiated and are really beneficiating from the pandemic nowadays, because they allow us, all of us, to exchange at a distance, and especially for family or social relations. For example, Netflix has attracted more than 10 million new subscribers during the pandemic, and maybe you noticed that there is a new serial until a few weeks now, which is called Social Distance. And this new serial of Netflix is about the pandemic, and it has been filmed at a distance by various actors who are not located in the same place. So that's a kind of reflexive vision on the process of the GAFAM. It's very interesting to see the rise of these distant proximities. But is that durable? Can it last? We don't know at that moment. But I want just to show you the drop in the Zoom action at the announcement of the Pfizer vaccine 3 days ago. This is the drop of the NASDAQ. So Zoom used to increase every day, and then at the announcement of the Pfizer, they suffered for a big loss. We'll see what will happen in the future, and if this vaccine or the vaccine will be successful or not. But it's really interesting to see this shift. I have to say about proximity that this proximity, either geographical or organized, has some basis in the so-called proxemics, which has been developed by Edward T. Hall in the 60s. So the idea of proxemics is that each person, each human being is surrounded by a surface, a kind of bubble that constitutes an emotionally strong zone or individual security perimeter. In a way, in proxemics, 4 different types of zones or areas are identified. So one is the intimate distance, which is the distance of a great physical involvement, the high sensory exchange, that's the way to come glass, to touch, that's the distance of touch. Then there is a personal distance, which is reserved to specific conversation, interaction with close friends and family members. The social distance is reserved for interaction with friends and colleagues, and it applies particularly well in the context of work, and also the public distance is reserved to the thoughts of people. So you see that we are surrounded, if we adhere to the idea of mix, we are surrounded by several bubbles, and those bubbles, they indicate the way we are coping with geographical proximity as well. Because, and we finish probably on that, because man is a human animal coping with proximity. So we are working with the geographical proximity and organized proximity on a day-to-day way. And we are doing that in the same way as other animals, or as the trees. For example, it is well now addressed and informed that a lot of species take social distances when they are sick. And also even the idea of this, the so-called crown shyness of the big trees in forest areas. They never touch themselves and always let a gap between the big trees, even in the Amazon, even in the Amazon forest, for example. So we have to cope with that. And now with this pandemic, we come back to the most animal part of ourselves in order to cope with geographical proximity. So let me come with a few brief conclusions about this.
Am ți-l iau, dar nu am cum, că n-am...
Excuse us, somebody has the microphone open and we can't hear the presentation. Please. Sorry. Okay, we can go.
Thank you. So these are only preliminary conclusions because, okay, the story continues and it will go on. So the first idea is that the geographical proximity matters. Even in an era where it is said that that's the depth of distance, we can exchange everything at a distance and we can, no, it matters. And it has been at the core of the diffusion of the pandemic. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, geographical proximity has become and is still a great danger, and it is mostly unwelcome. It is somewhat replaced by organized proximity at distance by means of virtual exchanges, Zoom meetings, and so on, which is less risky. And these virtual exchanges are crucial and they are expanding. And probably they will last, a part of them will last in the future. As I told you, we'll never come back to the original situation. But the main question, which still remains, is can a society live and function remotely? Of course not. Nowadays, because we need face-to-face relation for job purpose, a lot of them. At that moment, we are still stick to our face-to-face relation, and we need a lot of material input in our work relations. Secondly, because for family and friendship reasons, we need to meet the other ones to chant to them, to touch them, to kiss them, and so on and so on. And this is very important in terms of mental health. And of course, we have to avoid, and that's the last problem, and probably the most important one nowadays. We have to try to avoid the separation between two types of population. So on the one hand, teleworkers who can stay safe at home or in devoted places, and other persons which could be obliged to go, to take the transport, to commute, to go to work, to touch materials and so on, and who are really at the risk to be affected by the pandemic. So I've finished. Thank you very much, and I will welcome your question, of course.